So hi, my name is Sandra Matz and I'm a professor at Columbia Business School. I work at the intersection of psychology, computer science, and business, really trying to understand human behavior, human preferences, human motivations from a data-driven point of view. So the way that most companies, I think, are currently using data is mostly to predict behavior, right? If you think about companies like Amazon or Netflix, they look at your past behavior, they map it against the behavior and the preferences of millions of other people to predict which products you might be interested in, which movies you might want to watch next. For me, the beauty and magic of data comes in when we move from prediction to understanding. So not just asking what is someone going to do next and trying to drive that behavior, but really trying to go deeper and understand why. Why is someone interested in buying insurance? Is it because they're anxious, they're organized, they care about their dependents? Why is someone interested in art? Is it because of their aesthetic preferences, because they think it's part of the culture? It's like maybe maintaining some of the heritage that they see within their own countries and organizations. So for me, this idea that the more we understand the why of consumers, the deeper underlying psychological dimensions from emotion to motivations to fears, that goes a long way in serving them better, right? When it comes to serving the products that really respond to these deeper emotional needs and not just these surface level behavioral traces. So the better you understand your consumers based on the data that they generate, right? Anything from the products that they're interested in, like the searches that they make on Google, and extrapolating to these deeper psychological dimensions of their personality, their preferences, their emotions, their motivations, you can actually connect with consumers at a much deeper level that goes beyond individual transactions, right? You're not just in the market of saying, I'm going to try and get person A to buy this product here now. What you're trying to accomplish is to try and build a long-term relationship that creates a loyal customer that wants to buy from you again and doesn't just jump to the competition the next time they see something fancy on social media. So this kind of connection that you have with consumers is strengthened by your understanding of their needs and preferences. And I think that's a critical component that companies understand and also implement in a way that provides genuine value for consumers, right? It's not just making predictions, it's not just driving profits in the short term, but it's trying to figure out how can I help my consumer with the problem that they're trying to solve. I mean, it's for me, one of the big questions that companies have to ask themselves is what are some of the data points that they have access to just by merely collecting traces, whether that's first-party purchases, whether that's access to third-party data that has become really, really cheap in many instances. But for me, the question is like, how do you combine that data with data that is provided potentially by consumers directly? But if we think about this creation of trust and this creation of long-term relationships, it's not just how do you exploit the data that is automatically given to you by consumers without really thinking about it, right? Oftentimes the data just gets collected. For me, the interesting part is like, what are some of the touch points that you have with your consumers where you can complement this existing data with first-hand user experiences, whether that's them telling you how the experience was with a certain product, what they loved about it, what they didn't love about it, or even an onboarding process where consumers can say very clearly, here's the goal that I have with using your product, here's what I feel comfortable with, you using my data when it comes to personalization, when it comes to service, and here's where I'm not. So I don't want you to use this data, but I'm happy to give you some additional information that allows you to potentially make your product better for me. I think that's a tension that companies have to grapple, and I would always err on the side of providing genuine value for consumers in a way that makes them part of the process. So for me, it's really this deeper underlying psychological foundation that is much easier to predict than ever. So companies have for a long time had access to these individual data points, right? So someone's purchases, maybe their browsing history, maybe some of the content that they could collect on social media, but it was very much disjointed. It was like this universe of data that maybe an algorithm could make sense of, but certainly not a human, just because the complexity was way too high. Now, I would say about 10, 15 years ago, there was this field of research that started translating these traces into psychological construct like personality, personal values, preferences, that lifestyle choices that make sense to both an algorithm and humans. But it was very limited by the fact that you needed access to these models. You needed access to saying, I can translate your credit card spending or your browsing histories into indications of how extroverted or how impulsive or how emotionally stable you are. Now, with the introduction of these more general large language models, transformer models that can really solve tasks that they were never trained for, you can democratize this process entirely. I can now ask a ChatGPT and say, here's someone's social media profile, here's someone's credit card spending. Why don't you tell me if that person is more liberal, conservative, if that person is more extroverted or introverted? And it's never been trained to do that, but it is a remarkable job. And that means anyone who has a ChatGPT account can now make these predictions for potentially millions of users at the same time. So for me, it's really this transition to it was just data that was individual data points, very hard to make sense of, to we had a world where few companies had access to translating these data into meaningful psychological constructs, to now a world where anyone can do that and not just make those predictions, but also build on them in creating personalized content. I do believe that it's important for leaders to be somewhat skeptical about the use of data, about the use of AI, because there are certainly risks associated with handing over power to a model that you probably don't fully understand. So like any conversation around algorithmic fairness, biases, and algorithmic decision making, I think are incredibly important. However, at the same time, I think it's equally important for leaders to recognize that there's always a status quo. There's always a counterfactual. Right? If you think about that in the context of hiring, for example, we know that algorithms have a history of potentially being biased against certain kind of underrepresented groups that historically have been disadvantaged in the labor market, and they might have these biases baked into the decisions that they make. So I agree that it's really important for these leaders to probe the models and do everything they can to de-bias. However, most of the time, I think when there's such a strong focus on the potential downsides of AI and this kind of notion of algorithmic fairness and bias, that leaders oftentimes forget the counterfactual. And the counterfactual is human decision making, which in many, many cases is just as biased, right? So yes, an algorithm might be somewhat biased in the way that they hire people, but so is your human workforce. So are people in HR who make these decisions based on their experience, based on their gut, based on how similar the person across from the table is to themselves. And those biases in humans is oftentimes harder to understand than the bias in algorithms, and even harder to fix once you've identified it. So for me, the one message that I want leaders to take away is do the best you can to probe the models that you're working with and when you kind of decide to use AI as a decision maker. But don't forget that there's also this counterfactual where you being overly worried about a biased AI might actually inadvertently lead you to stick with a process that's even more biased just because humans are biased just equally or sometimes even more.